Hello, hello, hello. Welcome back to TOXstream, the live video show of AltaTox Academy. My name is Matteo, and I am the host of this space. And I'm very happy to be here, and I hope you're doing fine during this evening at the end of April. If you don't know us, if it's the first time that you're actually joining us, what we do here in this space is inviting experts and sharing with them stories of science and alternative methods to animal testing in toxicology, because that's what we are all about in AltaTox Academy. And if you are interested in this topic as well, I would suggest you to have a check to our website, academy.altatox.be, and to follow us on the social media, where you can actually find all the information of all the wonderful activities that we have on this topic. And today is our 5th episode already, which is very cool. And if you actually happen to miss one of them before, well, I can suggest you to go and check them out. They are both on our website or on our YouTube channel. So make sure to have a look there. I'm sure that you're going to find something of your interesting. So today we have a new story focused on NAMs, or new approach methodologies, or methods that can be used to reduce, replace, or refine the use of animal in toxicology. And specifically, we focus on a computational methodologies, which is called quantitative adverse outcome pathway. And it's quite interesting one, because when I was preparing for this episode, I realized that the cool part of this technique is that it tries to solve one of the basic problems, not only of toxicology, but of science in general, which is complexity. Because in a very simple way, qAOP, as is also said, is a way to organize and categorize information, which is a pretty big deal in science nowadays. And indeed, if you have a look at your average PhD student computer, I'm pretty sure that you will find that the way in which information are categorized and organized look pretty much like this one, which is not the best way to do it, probably. But to be fair, this is because we are scientists, and scientists has to deal with something pretty complicated, which is science and the way in which things works in this planet, which is not very easy to understand. And indeed, if you, for example, think of a very basic pathway within a cell, a human cell, for example, this is something that you ended up picturing in your mind, or if you actually try to use Google as I did. And this picture seems to be, it's relatively well done and quite well structured, but is anything but clear. So it is absolutely crucial for us to find ways to organize and structure the information that we have, especially because we've become very, very good at creating data, but not that much at organize it properly. And qAOP can have a big role in this sense, and I can show you a video to try to make you understand how it works.
The adverse outcome pathway is a tool to organize your knowledge into a series of building blocks that describes an adverse effect that occurs at various levels of biological organization. Imagine a chemical that binds to a protein or receptor at the molecular level. Because of this binding, the chemical can induce an effect at other biological levels, such as cellular, tissue, organ, organism, and population levels. It is similar to the domino effect, a chain reaction induced by chemicals or other stressors such as radiation, nanoparticles, or pathogens such as viruses. And most importantly, the AOP is a way to explain causally how a chemical induces a harmful effect.
So qAOP is something that is becoming more and more important in toxicology nowadays. And it seems to be pretty successful, at least judging by the fact that they have their own Wikipedia, which doesn't mean that they have their own Wikipedia page, which pretty much everybody has nowadays, except us, but we're working on that. But rather that they have their own Wikipedia version, which I guess it's a place where fan of AOP goes to vote for their best AOP. I don't really know exactly what they use that for, but it's there, so I'm assuming is a sign of the technique being successful. So for all these reasons, today we're gonna give a more close look to how qAOP works, how it can be used in toxicology, and which kind of use can have as well in regulatory toxicology. And as always, I am not going to be the one doing most of the talk, but we invite two guests which have a lot of experience on qAOP and will be able to help me guide this conversation. So I think it's time for you to meet the experts. So I said experts because indeed tonight we don't have only one expert, but we actually double down and we have two experts. So double the fun. And they are both coming from the John Moores Liverpool University. And as I said, they have quite a lot of experience on qAOP and toxicology in general. So I'm sure that they will be able to give us more information on this. So I am very happy to bring on stage and introduce you with Professor Mark Cronin and Dr. Nicoleta Spînu. Hello. Ciao, Mark. Ciao, Nicoleta. How are you?
Hello, everyone, and especially also those that are watching us.
Thank you very much for accepting the invitation. Okay, so what's your mood today? First time that you do something like that, I'm assuming.
It is, yeah. So interesting, exciting, different way of getting a message across, so it's good.
And it's the first time I have two people at the same time, so I'll see how it works on speaking on top of each other all the time, but I promise we'll try to behave. So first of all, I would like to start by with a big thank you with Nicoleta, because the video that I just showed you before, which was probably the clearest part of my introduction, was done by her and is actually part of a longer video which explains all the story of your PhD, if I understood correctly. So first of all, thumbs up, because you basically did my work for me, which is great. And also, I wanted to ask you maybe quickly the story of that video, how it came up to be. Was your idea? Was the idea who? How was the process in general?
Thank you, Matteo, for this feedback. It means a lot, and I think my best friend who helped me, Xenia, might also watch right now us. The idea came from the fact that I wanted to explain what I did to my family, my cousins, and my nephews, and it ended up to be also a version in English and a little bit more complicated. I still find the video to be still complicated and not very well explained. But basically, I wanted somehow to reach to general public and to explain what I did and what it means to do a PhD. And that definitely wouldn't have been possible without so many implications and the support that I had, including from Mark. And I think that should be able to be seen through the video as well.
And was Mark involved as well in this endeavor, or?
No, I wish I had been. It was a wonderful surprise when Nicoleta sent me the link, and I would encourage everyone to look at it. Everyone I've shown family, I've shown colleagues, and they're all blown away about it just because of the imagination, the getting such complex messages across really, really simply. So I congratulate Nicoleta and also her friend who helped to do it. It's absolutely brilliant.
Maybe I have to disclosure that Xenia Morgan, she is a storyboarder professional, and that's why the video itself looks, I think, so well.
Well, I guess both the combination of the expertise on the drawing and your story was very compelling. So I will definitely put it in the comment of the video, so you can actually go and recover it. Okay, well, thank you about that. So before the way in which I usually start here is I always like to ask to the guest how do they ended up doing what they do, and it's always interesting to hear the answer and see the path that they follow during their life. So I would say we can start with Mark, and then I will jump with Nicoleta.
Well, I've got a very long story, so I will try and cut it short. I'm a biologist. My first scientific love was environmental science, and I did my PhD in Liverpool in what was then environmental QSAR in the 80s, and I did a postdoc in human health QSARs, and I've kept up the interest in both ecotox and human health since then. So people coming out and saying that we should consider both together is not new to me. I've continued in the QSAR area. We've expanded into read across, and possibly I'll give you a little bit of history later on the AOPs, but I ended up in the AOP area as well, and interested in I guess, mechanistic toxicology, how we translate mechanistic toxicology into something that's useful, and how we think about computer modeling. And I started my journey in machine learning in the 1980s when it was fairly difficult to do it because of the software. And now, of course, we've got this explosion of models and possibilities. So it's really exciting to see the next generations coming on and beginning to get excited in the same way I was 30 years ago.
Well, thank you. Nicoleta, how did you end up here?
Well, my journey when it comes to qAOPs began with the PhD, which was part of an European-funded research project, known and abbreviated as VIN3 project, led by Paul Jennings at Vrije Universiteit in Amsterdam. And the project itself was supervised by Mark. And during the past years, I got the opportunity to understand what the mechanistic toxicology is about, and also how to model computationally. And also what would be the challenges in modeling specifically qAOPs, and what is needed in order to advance the concept itself.
Oh, I
So
understand.
that's the short story of why I'm here.
Well, I like the fact that you're the first two that actually tells me that they did that in a more linear way, because most of my guests, they ended up saying, I am here by chance because it took a couple of the tours in my life, which is always interesting, but good for you, I guess. Okay, so usually it would be necessary to do some kind of introduction of what qAOP, but let's pretend that my introduction was flawless and everything was clear, unless you want to add something to the few slides that I had at the beginning on what qAOP is.
Well, I'm sure we'll talk about it. So yeah.
A little bit. Then as well, I would like to start on the historical point of view, on where qAOP comes from, which is something that I had, at least it's mentioned already quite some time ago in 2010. Then I don't know exactly how this is a long time ago in toxicology or not. I mean, 2010 looks quite a long time ago in the world, but then maybe in toxicology not so much. And I'd like to have your perspective on that side. Maybe we can start with Mark, because I have no idea what Nicoleta was doing in 2010. I was mostly failing my exams at bachelor, so I'm assuming you were in a similar situation.
I'm sure you didn't fail anything, Matteo. I'm sure it went very well. Let's start with AOPs. You've given us an introduction to AOPs, and of course, and quite rightly, we all think back to the 2010 paper by Jerry Ankley and colleagues at US EPA. That is the classic starting place. But really, it goes back a lot further than that. And I would put it in the context, as I said, I was interested in mechanistic toxicology, and even in the 1980s, the work coming out of the EPA, particularly the Duluth lab, was very much about organizing mechanistic data, and that progressed. What we also had in about 2007, 2008, of course, was the concept coming out of 21st century toxicology, and the work from Mel Anderson and Dan Kruski, and they put a lot of effort into promoting the pathway concept, and that we could understand toxicology through the perturbation of pathways and trying to model that. So in a way, all these things came together. Of course, we were almost 10 years after the publication of the white paper that became REACH in 2010. REACH had come in the European Union, had come into effect. That's the chemicals legislation. I apologize that the latest version. So we had a lot of drivers to do things differently. And it also coincided with a lot of new technologies coming out. And exactly as you said, the AOP concept gave us a way of organizing all of these bits and pieces into a lovely framework. And I remember the first concepts of this, which is this linear boxes being joined together, which we still think about. And of course, we criticize as being over simplistic. And I got involved, just to give a little bit of background, this was actually taken up by the OECD QSAR toolbox management group initially through, and I really should, the three people I want to acknowledge here is Gil Weiss, who was consultant at the OECD, Bob Diedrich, who was then leading this effort, and Terry Schultz, and they really pushed it forward. And it was that spur, 2011, 2012, through the OECD, that really pushed it on, the OECD, the AOP concept. That then got taken up into the EGMAS group, where it now sits. So it got taken away from the OECD QSAR toolbox, but still you'll see remnants of this if you look in the toolbox. So we had this framework, which we can call qualitative at that time, and we were already beginning to put data together. There were some really nice data streams, and there were some wonderful examples from ecotox, particularly from endocrine disruption pathways, about putting data together. So we were already at the start of this, putting data streams together and beginning to wonder how we could extrapolate from the initiating events up through the key events. That really has spurred us into this whole area of qAOPs, where we're trying to find data, and as you've mentioned, NAMs, and we need to use those NAMs data. So we're trying to find these data and make them usable. So the situation we're in now is we're doing a lot more work into it, and we're able to develop different types of models, but we're still thinking about the types of models and beginning to know what they are. I think I'll let Nicoleta chime in if she has any other. I think she's done so much work recently that she's much more up to date with the current status.
Well, there is always something that I can learn from Mark, and this experience, I think also it's something interesting to everyone. For now, I think we will cover all the other topics through the next questions, I believe.
Okay.
I'm sure that I can add anything right now to the history itself. Of course, yes, everything that Mark said, some of which I also know from Mark.
Well, thank you for the summary. At least we're all on the same page, and now we know what we're going to talk about, which was especially useful for me, at least. And okay, now that we know what we're going to talk about, you already replied a little bit to that, Mark. Why would we care? Why qAOP it's important? And okay, you started by saying we need to have a way to categorize information, but why is that? Why do we need a way to categorize information? What's the advantage and the necessity in toxicology in that sense?
Lots of reasons. A really, really good question, and I could probably talk for too long on this. So let's think. As I said, I'm a biologist, and I really think in patterns. I've learned that through my life. I find remembering facts very difficult, but I can see patterns and I can understand patterns. So this is a way of understanding when we have a chemical that's interacting with the body, the process by which it causes or may cause an adverse effect or a toxicity. And of course, what I should have said is traditionally, we're using animal tests mostly to find out these adverse effects, and we want to move away from this. We want to make things more human relevant. So the AOPs has allowed us to understand more about mechanisms. I think we knew a lot of that information already, but it's allowed us to put it into a framework where we can work with it much better. It also has put it into a standardized framework, if I can put it that. So now we have certain concepts such as molecular initiating event, key events, key event relationships, which we're very familiar with, and we're not frightened about using those terms. And we also, as I said, we're getting these wonderful new technologies, often using human cells that will give us information and responses. So we've got this situation where we have an organization for our information, and now we're getting the data to put into that organization. And the qAOPs are allowing us to use the data to extrapolate up. And the ultimate goal, and Nicoleta and I have been involved in several discussions in this in the past couple of months. The ultimate goal, of course, is to use this, or to allow us to use data from our NAMs, so the in vitro assays, and extrapolate that up to a whole body, a whole organism response. And of course, thinking back to the original AOP concept, that went up to population and even ecosystem responses as well. But let's think about it in terms of replacing animal tests. That it's giving us a framework where we can build some models and we can use these new human relevant, ethical, hopefully cheap, hopefully rapid data that are going to provide information to allow us to do chemical safety assessment. And just as an aside, I went to the AOP wiki just before, and we do use that as a resource. And what's interesting there is the variety of ways that we're using the AOP concept. So a couple of things. For a while now, that there've been AOPs describing the effects of weather and how that can cause adversity to environmental species. So you might think about excess heat will cause might cause organisms to die, and that will affect an ecosystem. So those kind of aspects we have is used to organize information about radiation, but also as well importantly, there's now several AOPs around COVID. So if we think about this isn't a chemical insult, but this is a way of organizing that mechanistic information about how the virus is bringing about an effect. And of course, once we have that, we can begin to look at the places where we can interact with the virus. So it's not just toxicity, but it's organizing complex information, particularly biological systems information, and allowing us to put numbers in. And as a biologist, I get that. I'm really excited about this. And what we need to do now is Nicoleta is coming along and giving us her expertise in the modeling approaches and the data analysis approaches. So it's a really exciting time. So I don't know whether you have anything to add, Nicoleta. Sorry, I've hogged it a bit.
And you are free to disagree. It's always good for the audience. Huh?
Maybe indeed I can add a few other ideas. For example, one of the things that I've learned during my traineeship at the Joint Research Center is that the AOP seems to be an excellent tool to communicate about like gathering so many expertise around an endpoint or a topic, and then try to disseminate and to understand where the gaps are, what can be done, if anything can be done. And that's something that I saw the value in the AOP concept and qAOP as well.
Okay, so well, what I understand from all these, it's my very limited experience, is that okay, qAOP is a great box that we can use to put stuff inside, and you touched upon this a little bit. But what do we put inside? Which type of data do you usually need to populate, let's say, this picture, this puzzle that you are trying to create? I think maybe we can jump with Nicoleta this time.
Great. I will start by saying that in order to think about data, we need to think about causal structure, and AOP at the end, it's a causal model. Because when we have, for example, this representation, be it linear or network, we need to make sure that that causal graph has a meaning behind. So it's not an association between some sort of information. And of course, there are different ways of how we can evaluate the causality. And one way, the way it is promoted in toxicology is by evaluating the Bradford-Hill considerations. And once we have that causal graph, we can think next step, what kind of data we have available. So in terms of types of data, definitely we'll start with empirical evidence. But more recently, we will move into new approach methodologies. For example, endpoints such as neurotoxicity, where there is a big gap in terms of data, we can see the utility and the value of NUMS approaches. Then also when we talk about data, that causal graph would be composed of several nodes. And that each of the nodes would represent a key event or biological event. When we think about qAOP models, we want data that would be measured for pairs of key events, so data that would be associated to a key event relationship. Because the way I usually try to explain a qAOP, the way I see it, It's definitely a causal model that should predict causal quantities, which we can define by key event relationships, for example. And then also when it comes to data, I think, as I kind of already touched a bit upon, it's also about team effort, because we have those that comes from decision making, from risk assessment, those that come from lab, and they can share their expertise and experience if the biological events really happen in the sequential order, the way we identified based on the existing evidence or not. So to summarize briefly, we need a hypothesis that should be a causal graph. The data then comes depending on that causal graph, and it can be from everything that we have to developing and validating new tools for that.
And in that sense, so you said you need to use, of course, different data, so you need different figures basically in the lab. So the aspect of the interdisciplinarity here, how easy it is to do it? What's the biggest challenge in that sense? I mean, to put together different figures in the same place.
That's so excellent put, because indeed it goes back, in my opinion, to communication. And I think we already have several examples of research projects. For example, risk hunt 3R, precision tox, on tox projects, where I think this type of team effort will be possible to be seen through the development of qAOP models, where different variety of expertise and also interests and endpoints can be covered.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. I mean, I was thinking before about, well, who would be the perfect person to do a qAOP, and there is no, that person does not exist. Nicoleta's come from well, she can describe her own background, but some toxicology training, but has taught herself all this wonderful modeling. She's really opened my eyes to some of these concepts like causality, and understanding why that's important, and why we get these approaches. But likewise as well, we need mechanistic toxicology in here. We do need statistical modeling. We need informatics. We need chemistry to a certain extent. And so it really does become a team effort, which is great. But then it also means, of course, that we're ending up with quite complex models. And with Nicoleta mentioned about communication, and one of the key aspects here is that when we're thinking about using these models and justifying a prediction, which is what we may need to do in certain circumstances, such as for regulatory use, then the models become quite transparent. So we always have to think, I mean, it's not unique in toxicology in any way, but we always have to think about justifying our data, justifying the model, justifying the decision we want to make from it. And we're really at the start of that journey, I think, with qAOPs at the moment.
Right. And yeah, I mean, that indeed it's something that makes it a bit, especially the concept of causality. Indeed, it's something that is not so easy maybe to grasp at the first aspect. And I know that you prepared actually some slides. That's why, I mean, you are the best guest ever that I had, because you even prepared some slides that are more to explain more practically exactly what we mean by qAOP and the concept of causality. So I'm gonna bring them here, and you can try to guide me through what the hell is this, which it's very difficult for me, of course, to follow. But this is how an AOP looks like. All right.
This is actually an AOP network, and it is composed of 9 linear AOPs. And we use the AOP wiki knowledge base for that. And yeah, we consider this an opportunity to showcase again one of our modeling approach and how we would look at the problem.
Of course, you're allowed to brag as much as you want. It's your PhD, come on.
Yeah, thank you. And so in the green boxes are the molecular initiating events. So the chemical or any other type of stressor needs to bind to that molecular initiating event in order for the biological path to actually happen. And then in the red, we have the adverse outcomes, which in our case, they were 3, but all of them were linked to neurotoxicity. And we did the same approach for several other organs. but we found that neurotoxicity network was the most advanced, and also most of these AOPs, linear AOPs, are endorsed, which in a way already gives credibility when it comes to causal understanding and acceptance. And then when we wanted to go into the modeling side, we realized that it's not possible to have data for all key events. And of course, also one of the blocks, which would be a key event, can be measured in different ways. And through an expert judgment, and actually an expert group that was during an workshop, Lawrence workshop, a couple of years ago, we had several brainstorming sessions, and we decided on what would be the most representative key events in terms of connectivity within this network, but also in terms of available data. So on the other side of the slide, we see the simplified version of this AOP network, which was a solution when it comes to availability to data and also based on the knowledge from the experts. And if we go to the next slide,
so if I understand, basically every single box here is connected from some sort of causality. So one leads to the next because we have information that can tell us that one leads to the next.
Of course, totally, that's correct.
Okay.
It's just, of course, we still, even this information, we need to treat with some sort of, there is always an associated degree of bias. And ideally, we need to think of uncertainty and hopefully also to quantify that uncertainty through the modeling workflow. But overall, if we start with what we have, it's still possible. And the objective was to go further into the modeling side and to see what is actually possible to be done.
Okay, yeah, it's good that I'm following.
I just want to say, I remember when Nicoleta showed me this as part of her PhD, and I was familiar, very, very familiar with this concept of the linear AOP. I'd thought, I suppose, it should come up in conversations about the network. And then Nicoleta said, well, have a look at this. And I've combined 9 AOPs. They fit together beautifully. And then the whole concept of being able to use this with those blue boxes in the middle, which are our key events that we're interested in, just so many things fitted together. And then Nicoleta started to put this in the context of uncertainties of this causality. And then we started to think, Nicoleta started to think, where are we going to get data? What kind of data would fit those 4 blue boxes there? Mm-hmm. And this really is the power of it, that it's organized decades of research and mechanisms of action. And from this, it's justified, in effect, what could be 3 key events, fundamental key events, for which we can gain data to make the prediction. And as I say, I just think this is, as a biologist, this is a thing of great beauty. I must admit, I think it's absolutely fabulous work.
Indeed, it really putting together all the knowledge. I mean, how long it took you to do this? Like an entire PhD?
Well, as I said, we did that for several organs because of the PhD being part of a bigger project where we studied several organs. We conducted this analysis for all of them. And I think it was about half a year or the first year of the PhD, definitely I focused on that because it implied also some curation. When it comes to the ontology part, even at the AOP wiki knowledge base level, there are key events that might have been named in different ways, but still having the same meaning behind or like the same type of measurements. So yeah, it was necessary to spend a little bit more time. And I think there is an opportunity to think about more data mining approaches, but also tools when it comes to develop and to automatize this process of developing AOP networks.
Mm-hmm. Of course. Yes, then you have another slide which confused me more than that one, but I'm sure you will be able to guide me here.
Those 4 boxes are the first 3 in green, which are each independent key events, and then in the red we have adverse outcome. And here I wanted to show which type of data we used as input for the model part. That's also in order to show that it requires, depending of course on the endpoint, but herein we really wanted to make sense of a data set, because you can have lots of data, but actually to make it useful, that's the purpose, and for that you need somehow to justify whatever value you include or whatever variable you decide to select. And so we included information from in silico models, from QSARs, and also from other models that were either developed, for example, within the IN3 project, or we were able to find in the literature. We then also screened the existing scientific literature for any evidence for the reduction of BDNF, which is a protein. And surprisingly, I couldn't find back then, to almost 3 years ago, I couldn't find data for lots of chemicals that would have been measured to evaluate if a chemical would reduce or not the level of BDNF at the brain level. And for that, I screened the available literature to find some information. When it comes to the other biological events, for decrease of synaptogenesis and decrease of neural network formation, there are already in vitro models available, and that's an excellent, I think, achievement. And we were able to use that information for this model. Here you see that we have EC values, but actually it's also the concentration responses are also available. And we included data when it comes also to ATP, LDH, and everything that we consider to be useful for the model in order to provide trustworthy predictions. So the purpose here was to simplify, to show you what kind of data we used, and I picked this chemical bisphenol A, which was included in our list of chemicals that were studied. If you have any questions, I'm happy to.
No, I mean, it's beautiful. It's a beautiful slide, because indeed it summarizes the fact that here we are probably looking at dozens of papers and data and database that are putting together all this information. I mean, the amount of work that you must have put there reminds me why I don't do research anymore. It seems a lot of work. It's very, it's wonderful. And I remind also our audience that you can, of course, ask questions on your own, because as you can see, I'm very limited in the time that I can ask. And you can use the chat and whatever you are on Facebook, Twitch, YouTube, or LinkedIn, and I will bring the question to the expert, of course. And then we still have another one. Yes. Oh, okay.
This is
I like the boxes, not so much the other one.
Oh, this is my favorite slide. This is again blows me away. It really does. It's fabulous. Nicoleta.
We decided to use probabilistic modeling approaches. That's also because as part of the IN3 project, we had several scientific advisors, and I think I have to mention that one of the suggestions of focusing on probabilistic modeling came from Frédéric Bois. And so what we wanted to do is to understand, in my case, was to understand what exactly we can model probabilistically, if we can also somehow incorporate the uncertainty around the variability of data, and also to model any type of chemical, be it organic or inorganic. Here we have 3 chemicals where we see the probability for the chemical to induce each of the key events independently, but following the causal structure. So it keeps in mind how the biological path actually happens. And we can also see that it has a mean value, but it also has an interval, and that is the uncertainty around that value. So the decision is becomes more informative. And in that sense, we can also investigate why a specific interval is larger or not. Because our data wasn't a perfect data set, we had missing values. We needed to treat that missingness, and also we decided to do that in a probabilistic way. So we had several challenges, even with the data set that we prepared. That's why one of the reasons, for example, for sodium fluoride, for the second chemical, we had a very large uncertainty for the last prediction, just because we know that we had missing data for some of the key events, which was propagated through the workflow itself. And based on this, we can make different assumptions, either if a chemical can be considered positive or negative, or maybe additional investigation is required.
So if I understand, basically with this, you can also weight how sure you are of your affirmation when you go in this model. And I mean, you do have a threshold to say, okay, this is, yes, I like it, I'm going to put it here in the green box, or like, I'm not totally sure, I'm not going to put it there.
We did follow that. From the data itself, we try to make free categories with low, medium, and high probability. And that classification comes from the predictions themselves. So it's not a threshold that we decided by ourselves. Here it is. Sorry, yeah.
No, carry on, Nicoleta. Sorry, I didn't mean to butt in.
I just wanted to say that depending of the predictions, because we had different key events, so we decided to rather let the model tell us what is the level. Is it low, medium, or high? It's the only point.
Yeah, no, it's a really important point, and I think one of the problems is sometimes we just see biology and toxicology as a yes-no phenomenon. Yes, it is toxic. No, it isn't. Yes, it's toxic. Therefore, we have to do something about it. And of course, we do have dose response. We do need to bring in exposure, and this is beginning to allow us to think about the variability in data. We know that NAM data are gross simplifications of very complex systems, and that's fine. So we need to be able to put that variability into it. But as well as it's also these probabilistic approaches. As a biologist, again, I hate to keep going back to that. I'm really happy with that because I don't see everything as an absolute definite yes or no. We can test. We know from the animal data, the traditional tox data, that there is a great deal of variability. We can do the same test several times and get, at best, only slightly variations in potency. At worst, enormous variations in potency, despite our efforts to standardize it. So here we're trying to say, well, what does the evidence give us? It's going to be really difficult at the moment to put a threshold on to say we've reached that level of evidence, we can make our decision. To know what that threshold is, but we may know when we need to get more evidence. So, as we see these distributions narrowing down and giving us greater certainty about an outcome, we can begin to make a decision. And if we see a broad distribution, we say, well, we may need to do another test, or we may need more evidence to be able to make a decision. And remember, this is all derived from that beautiful network, which was derived from our understanding and organization of mechanistic toxicology and collecting data to enable us to do this. So these are the quantum leaps that we're able to take with this type of modeling. It's fabulous.
Indeed, no, it's very clear indeed. And there is one question that I found fascinating. I'm going to remove this for a second, which is very interesting. It's a bit long, but I will summarize. Basically, Annika was asking on the topic of interdisciplinarity. It is also a matter of terms, actually. So how do we call things? And we use terms like mechanistic or pathways while we talk with each other, but indeed, maybe we mean different things sometimes. And it's something that in science you have a lot. I mean, every time I try to read a paper and there are more than 5 different abbreviations, I'm always pissed because then probably they use different abbreviation with someone else, and it's very hard to follow what's happening. And is it something that affected your research? Did you see it? Did you happen to see it at some point? This issue with what people means with the different terms. And thank you, Annika, for the question.
Yes. Shall I start, Mark? I think. Yeah, thank you very much for the question. Indeed, when I started my PhD, I was looking for a definition myself, what a qAOP is and how I can use it to explain to others. And one of the things that I was encouraged also by Mark was to understand what other scientists think about. And we conducted an analysis by in the literature as well to see how scientists define the qAOP concept, because there is no a common definition in that sense. So I would say whenever there is a discussion about something, it's better if even if there is no an official definition, to define it and hopefully to agree all the scientists involved in that project to agree on that definition, at least a minimalistic one, because of course the concept itself is so novel that it can end up having so many applications and so many ways of developing it that just a minimum requirement of understanding would be, I think, useful.
Yeah, this is a really good point, and over my career, I've had conversations with people and then walked away thinking, yeah, were we actually talking about the same thing? Even today, we were talking about mechanistic models, and I think probably I have a different interpretation of what a mechanistic model is compared to other people, and I've had lots of other situations in my lifetime. For instance, defining what narcosis is. Narcosis means something different in ecotox as it does to human tox on occasions. And we're also in a project, and there's an abbreviation which you're probably familiar with, API. And if I say that abbreviation, if you're in the informatics community, you'll be thinking of programming interfaces. And if you're in pharmaceuticals, you'll be thinking of active pharmaceutical ingredients. And we had several years of a project, and then people realized when they were talking about APIs, the informatics people were talking about different things to the pharmaceutical toxicologists. So yes, that's and there's some solutions to that. And the one obviously is creating these ontologies, so common ways of defining something, an effect, even the physiological structures, physiological effects. And as I alluded to earlier, in a way, that's why AOPs have been successful, because we have been able to put in a common set of terms that are fundamental, and we define them very rigorously for the AOPs, at least early on. And as Nicoleta has said, we now have over 20 definitions of qAOPs, and so we're a long way from doing that. But I think that's good, because that within those definitions, we can see the variety of models and approaches and thought process we have. And I think it's true to say that we're going to see qAOPs as a range of modeling techniques, going from correlation regression up to these probabilistic type models. And we need to think a bit more, or we are now thinking about, what is the appropriate method for a particular situation. But yeah, it's a great question, and I'm sure as a scientific within toxicology, we've all got our favorite misunderstandings.
Yes, you probably can make an entire episode just on that, and I would actually love it, but we don't have time today. But so far, okay, we said everything that is good, let's say, with qAOP. That seems to be great all over, but I'm assuming that there are also some limitations and problem with this technique so far. And maybe you can give me a brief overview of which are the shortcomings of this technique so far. What can we do to try to overcome them as well? And Nicoleta, you can start, and then we jump to Mark, or you're free to organize yourself.
Yeah, let me start, because these challenges are also opportunities for developing, like giving more time to the qAOP and also to improve it. I'll start by saying that one of the challenges and one of the limitations still remains to think of some sort of integrative approaches, where when we talk about the different types of data, for example, we will measure key events at cellular level in one way, and then once we go through the biological levels, the data becomes in different, coming from different types of assays, images, comparing to structured type of data. And I think we need methods somehow to think of also building blocks in terms of computational side, how to treat each of the information and how to link the results from one model to the other. So this transition from cellular to multi-scale, I think that's where we need examples. Also, we need, in general, we need more examples in terms of showing applicability of the concept itself. Currently, we have a few of them, and I think if we can develop models where we can show how it is used in decision making, that will be extremely useful. And then some of my dreams is to see how a qAOP model becomes a generalized type of model, and how easily it can learn once new data and new evidence become available. Because, for example, we can have a model depending on what we have at the moment in the literature, later on we can come with omics data and we can understand if whatever we developed, if it's complete or not, and what is missing, what are the missing pieces. And so I want for the qAOP model to become a model that would allow to generalize the information itself, either to other chemicals, not to be so chemical specific, but also to any other stressors, and also to different scenarios, to be able to analyze different levels of exposures. And so, yeah, I think this would be some of the challenges that I would also recommend for those interested in the qAOP to focus on.
You want to add something, Mark?
No, I think
that was very clear. Great. No, I think you both painted a very clear picture of what qAOP is right now. At least myself, I understood much better than before. And before jumping on the last part, which would be more
maybe
related
can I take the advantage and mention something
absolutely
else? I think what we need when it comes to qAOP is to show that it's an iterative process, and ideally to make it in a transparent way so that everyone will be able to understand each step of a qAOP model, and will be able also to understand exactly how to model it, when it is used, and also to build trust around the workflow itself. And when I say that this iterative cycle, it's exactly about that we have different information, then the model is exposed to the public, to regulators, and then when we have that type of feedback, the model to be able to learn from that feedback and to provide better outputs, better causal quantities, for example.
And there is another question related indeed to this aspect in a way, on how we can be confident on in qAOP, and when do we say, okay, we like it as a qAOP. Because she's asking, okay, how important is that an qAOP is replicated in several studies before it's ended up in, it's found its way in the AOP wiki? Again, you have a threshold, or at some point you vote all together and say, yeah, it can go there.
I'll start just with some background on the AOP wiki. So at the moment, the current version of the AOP wiki is just capturing AOPs and not their quantification. And anyone could submit or begin to submit an AOP. It's really is a crowdsourcing activity. It's one of the most remarkable, certainly in toxicology and in many areas of science. And there is a formal process for adoption of AOPs, which is through the OECD EGMIST group, so a particular mechanistic toxicology group. I know there are moves to try and speed this process up. It's quite slow at the moment and does require currently very thorough peer review of AOPs. So from those AOPs, we're building our models, as Nicoleta has been describing, and it's a really good question when they become acceptable. And we haven't yet really teased that out sufficiently. But what we have been doing, and particularly some of Nicoleta's work, is understanding the characteristics of a qAOP, what we know is important, and whether we're meeting those, and also to put this in the context of uncertainties. And we've got various ways of defining the uncertainties of the components of an AOP and a qAOP, therefore. And Nicoleta also mentioned concepts such as the Bradford Hill criteria, which provide evidence of causality. So we're building frameworks to be able to determine whether a qAOP is reliable and we can have confidence about it. And the thing that, again, really attracts me about the uncertainty work is that we can effectively review qAOPs and determine where we've got areas of high uncertainty, and get more information to reduce that uncertainty. So there's no easy answer to that. It's a really good question, and I can't answer it. Nicoleta, let's have your thoughts as well.
I agree with what you said. I also think that maybe we can mention the idea of living document, Mark, because a qAOP should maybe, one of the things that we discussed during the PhD is that a qAOP model should be a living type of model. especially depending on the chemicals that we want to study. But if it is a living document, then we know that there is the legacy to understand better what kind of output the model gives and is it reliable or not.
And there's all sorts of complications as well on the living document front, because most AOPs are probably not complete. So we're going to have knowledge gaps. We're going to have low uncertainty in the key event relationships. So hopefully we can begin to fill in and plug those gaps. And that gives us an area of uncertainty. And we're already having these debates. How complete does an AOP need to be able to make it into a qAOP and make predictions from it? So this is, as I say, a real area for the future.
Yeah, of course, and as you picture it, is a very much work in progress in that sense as well. And related to that, before jumping on the last segment, which would be more related to the regulatory aspect of the qAOP, as we said a little bit throughout this presentation, this chat, it's also a matter of how we communicate and how we understand how to use qAOP. And in that sense, we tried to prepare, or rather, my colleague tried to prepare a little exercise which we could try to do all together and see if we actually understood what a qAOP is and how we can translate it maybe on our real life situation. So I will remove you for a moment from the live, but don't leave, because I'm gonna come back in a second. And it's now time to bring on stage my colleague Leonie Mueller.
Hi everyone, let me start off by also congratulating Nicoleta and Mark on your really amazing research. I really enjoyed everything you have discussed so far, and also Nicoleta, congratulations on all the great and successful efforts you have put into finding ways how to communicate such a very complex concept such as AOPs. I want to, now briefly also dive into the communication aspects and have some fun with AOPs. I thought about AOPs in the past. I am familiar, not as much as you are, but rather familiar with the concept for a while now, and I'm admiring it for a couple of years. And I was thinking about ways to communicate and to make it easier to explain this concept to people who are not as familiar with it as our colleagues sometimes are. So I try to find or to come up with everyday metaphors to explain this concept and that lean themselves to explaining this specific concept to people who don't have a background in life sciences, so maybe want to communicate to the general public, also our friends and families, or also policymakers. And I think you also made very clear the potential these concepts, especially the qAOPs, have when it comes to where they can lead and how they can be applied in the future. So we need to also be prepared to explain these concepts to a lot of people in the future that will have very different backgrounds in understanding this concept. So this is, again, just this very simple, and I think, Mark, you mentioned probably oversimplified linear understanding that we have of AOP. So as you nicely explained, we start with initiating events at the molecular level, and they are connected, and we move up in terms of organization and also size, and at the end we have an adverse effect in the organism. And for us, this is something we can grasp and that we can explain to people, but if you don't have a background in biology or environmental science or life sciences in general, then already the term macromolecular or receptor or initiating event can throw you off, and you lose the ability to understand this concept. So I was thinking hard for a week of a example that somehow fits into this structure, and it finally came to me, and I thought it was a great idea. And now I want to test this out on you, Nicoleta and Mark, as experts for AOP, and see if you would agree that this could be a nice example on how to explain AOPs to people. So usually on the left side, so we have our example is a fish. The example I put out, I chose is just a hormone, so endocrine disruptive chemicals. So we have an effect on the hormone system within animals. And opposed to that, I would propose to use cars as an example to explain this concept. I'm going to walk you through it. So in organisms, we have the initiating event where a chemical interacts on a molecular level with an organism. In the car example, this would be the person representing the chemical stepping into the car and the foot of the person hitting the gas pedal. This is the initial event that happens on the molecular level. So the gas pedal is pushed, and what happens next, everyone knows, the throttle valve opens. So we have a very good understanding, or everyone has a very good understanding what happens if you interact in a certain way with the car. So if you push the gas pedal, stuff happens within this car, and the outcome of the connection of all of these events is the car moves. So with the understanding of the car, and we have good understanding of cars because we build them, and also most people use them, we have a good understanding how these different events depend on each other. So if we see a car moving on the street, we know that someone pushed the gas pedal. So this is, in my opinion, a simplified, but maybe a good example to explain that the initiating event of a person's foot interacting with the car leads to a car moving. Where this example doesn't fit anymore is that we could argue that a car moving is not an adverse effect, but we could also, if we think this through and we say enough people move cars around, we might have traffic jams, or we might have climate change, and that in the end is the adverse outcome in this example. So now I want to ask Nicoleta and Mark what you think of my example, and if you also maybe have an idea how to change this example or come up with a different example that we could use to explain quantitative AOPs. And also I want to ask the audience if you have good or funny ideas on how to explain AOPs or qAOPs. You can put it in the chat. You can also send it to AltaTalks via our website. So we're interested to come up with just good ways to communicate this very important concept. So Nicoleta, Mark, do you have any thoughts on this metaphor?
I think my family would like more your example than what I did in our video. It's an excellent example in my opinion.
Yeah, and we didn't discuss this before, but believe it or not, when I used to talk about AOPs 7 or 8 years ago, the example I used was a car, and I didn't go into such detail, but I said, you know, I'd have a picture of a car, in particular a favorite car from many, many years ago, and I would say to get this to move, obviously we need the combustion engine, and my AOP was around the combustion engine, and not so the adverse effect, or the effect was the movement of the car. But to understand that, you had to understand the process of combustion engine, so the petrol going in, igniting, pushing a piston down, that being connected, and so forth. So yeah, I think it's a great example, and I'm just going to take the liberty that there's a question from Francois. Does it work with an electric car too? Well, of course it does, yes. But what we have is the initiating event and some of the key events are the same, but then it'll diverge and we'll have different key events. So rather than having fuel input to engine, rather than that being petrol, that of course will be electric from a battery. So what we would see is that we would have divergence there in this AOP, and I suppose ultimately if we had an ecosystem level, it would be pollution, could be air pollution, and then we could think about the other causes of air pollution. So we would begin to get our network that could be from burning fossil fuels and so forth. So we begin to put whole different areas in here, and I think it's just a really nice illustration that what we're trying to do here is organize disparate pieces of information. And with all of these, in terms of quantification, there's lots of them that you can put numbers to. So depending on how far down you push the accelerator, so you trigger the initiating event, that will determine how much petrol or electricity goes through into the engine and so forth. So that's where we would begin to quantify it. And ultimately, the pollution or the CO2 coming out, or the nitrous oxide or whatever coming out, could be related back to, directly through this model, to pressing the accelerator.
Yes, excellent. I think you maybe saw me taking notes because I like very much how you already started to expand this example, this metaphor. So thank you so much for your thoughts on that. Okay, I think with that, I'm going to hand over to Matteo. Thank you so much, Mark and Nicoleta, for discussing this with me.
Thank you. That was a great example.
Thank you very much indeed, Leonie. I just want to point out that when we were deciding which example to bring, I actually bring my example, which was about pizza making, and it didn't make in the final round, and I think there was some kind of discrimination there. But anyway, I think the car was better for everybody. So time is running. I think I wanted to still address one point, but before I saw that there was another question, which might be quite interesting to try to tackle if we can try to do it relatively quickly, even though it can open yet another world that we didn't touch upon. And it was a question from Adrian, and he was asking if in the when coming with AOP, do you use some sort of coding system for management of the data?
We use anything that it's available, and of course there are also data mining tools for if when we want to extract knowledge. For the management as well, there are initiatives and efforts going in that direction. I think it's at this level, when it comes to qAOP, it's not necessarily about the data themselves, but also how useful is the data. So it's rather the effort should, I think in my opinion, the effort should go what exactly we need to make an AOP, quantitative AOP. But otherwise, I know personally, and Mark also, I'm sure there are several initiatives when it comes to coding and proposing tools to facilitate such steps.
Yeah.
And maybe I should also mention that it's also important to rather think of what we have and make use of what we have than developing another data management tool.
Yeah.
Of course, no, that's a very practical view indeed. Yeah, so I wanted to jump to the last part where I always try to put all the techniques that we talk about in a more regulatory setting point of view, because I mean we said it already a few times during the chat that at the end of the day we want to use it somehow in a regulatory toxicology. And first of all, how are we right now in this sense? Is qAOP used already somewhere? To which extent is used? And maybe in which field specifically, if there are some contests in which it's more used than others?
Yeah, it's beginning to be used, and I'm certainly aware that some of these have been used to support REACH dossiers, but we're at the real start of this journey. And I think that there's two ways that we probably need to think about this. And let me start off by saying that anyone who knows me will know I am not a regulatory toxicologist. I have no regulatory experience whatsoever, so excuse the naivety of my thoughts. But the first is that under most of the current legislation, particularly REACH requires information equivalent to animal tests. So that implies implicitly that the qAOP has to provide information as equivalent to the animal test, and that's a debate, I think, for another day, what that means. Do we have qAOPs that do that yet? Well, probably only in very, very limited circumstances. And we can probably think about skin sensitization if we think about the AOPs there of being quantified and being able to do that. The future aspiration is obviously to move away from safety assessment that's based around surrogate species, being able to use human relevant tissues, human relevant cells, human relevant cell lines, and extrapolate that up to understand safety in particular scenarios. So it could be in manufacturing, occupational exposure, could be just in normal use, and even going up into understanding accidental exposure as well. So I think we're further off there. There's some really nice work that's been done in the cosmetics industries. Unilever, L'Oreal, Procter & Gamble, through Cosmetics Europe have done some lovely case studies where we're beginning to see how we might use qAOPs to comply with safety assessment in the first place, and then also the regulatory requirements. But we're in this invidious situation in most geographical regions where the legislation is still written in a way that requires information from an animal test or something equivalent to it. And I think we know that, but we probably don't know yet how to change that. And I could probably get in a lot of trouble by saying any more, but that's the situation that we're in.
Of course. And in a way related to that, because indeed it's about communication, try to understand how to use qAOP. There is this nice comment from Iwona that, well, first of all, says that the car example was great, so a thumbs up for Leonie. But indeed, the fact that we need to communicate the AOP to lay people that is a mechanism scenario, not an effect on the exposure. And indeed, when it comes to society, we always try to say yes or no, as Mark, you were saying before. And it's not always the case of one chemical is just completely bad or not. And actually, you can go back to see our last episode on in vitro testing, because we talk a lot about exposures and how much is the dose the issue. And maybe the very last question that I have, or rather it's observation, because one thing that fascinated me in the last few weeks when I actually realized it existed is the fact that when it comes to regulatory toxicology, it's not just a matter of finding something that works, but it's also a matter of finding something that is understandable in a way, which is something that opened my world. I mean, I didn't even consider that before. And how qAOP could go in this context? I mean, do you think it's something that can really help, visualizing something and say, that's why when I smell gasoline, this happened? Or again, it's just too complication on that sense?
I can.
Please, Nicoleta.
Okay. That's an excellent question, and that's also something that I've learned through my PhD. And that's something that came especially during my traineeship at GRC, where I was led by Andrew Orff. And Andrew taught me that there is you can be a young researcher, but if you want your research to be taken further, you also need to think in terms of policy. You need to think about how much whatever you develop can be explainable, can be understandable enough. And also, Ivona mentioned exactly that it can't be just 1 or 0. And that's where we decided with my PhD, to go into probabilistic approaches, because there definitely we do not have 1 and 0, and we can actually understand better the processes and can better understand these tipping points when it comes to qAOPs. It's much more informative if we rely on probabilistic approaches based on my experience so far.
Yeah, and I just like to support that and say, remember, in the many current regulatory situations, we have to justify why our alternative is valid according to the legal framework in which we're working. And in terms of, again, going back to being a biologist, I can justify an AOP because we've got the mechanistic understanding, the mechanistic evidence. We know where our gaps are, we know where our strengths are. So we're putting our model on that mechanistic evidence, and we're saying this is the model that fits it. Therefore, this is our justification, because we're always going back to causality, as Nicoleta has said, and biology and the mechanistic relevance.
Great. Well, I think you applied to my question completely. Well, that was my last question. I think I abused of your time long enough. Thank you very much for agreeing to be harassed by me for 1 hour and something. You were fantastic. At least now I have a much better understanding of what qAOP is and can be used, and hopefully will be in the future. So unless you have anything else that you want to share with us.
Well, thank you to you for the invitation and for this opportunity.
Thank you
Indeed,
again.
thank you very much. It's been good fun, hasn't it?
We are going to be able to speak again soon.
Good.
And so with that is the end of this episode. I hope you had fun. I hope you learned something, and I hope you had a bit of both. We are going to come back not in 2 weeks as we usually do, but we're going to come back the 26th of May with a new episode. We are going to release the topic in just a week before, so stay tuned on our social media to see exactly what it is. And once again, if you liked what we do, I do encourage you to subscribe to our channel or following us, whether you are on Facebook, YouTube, Twitch, or LinkedIn. And you can also have a look in our website to see all the activities that we do related to alternative method to animal testing, new approach methodologies, and science in general. And with that, I thank you very much for watching this, and I see you next time.